So here we go with chapter 17 out of 18 in this textbook on human evolution. Of course, this has got to be a fascinating topic for almost anyone because intrinsically we all sort of want to know where we come from and what our origins are. The whole topic of evolution is controversial in the world of some faiths and some religions, conflicting with origin stories, and probably nowhere else do these conflicts come up more than the topic of human evolution. Regardless, there's of course abundant evidence for humans being descended from ancestors shared with non-human species, and the fossil record shows pretty clearly that humans evolved in Africa from common ancestors with chimpanzees, bonobos, and other primates. And now with the tools that we have in the world of genetics and genomics, we're able to pin down with even more refinement our evolution at a molecular level. So that's just kind of an introductory comment from me, but the introduction to this chapter in your textbook is well worth reading. This whole chapter is worth reading. It's very well written and intriguing, and does a good job of summarizing pretty well where we come from and the evidence for that. So the introduction points out that our own lineage, called Hominins, is the sister lineage to chimpanzees and bonobos. Indeed, they are hypothesized to be our closest living relatives. And human evolution has not been progressive, like in any kind of linear way towards some obvious goal. That point has been made in regards to other types of life, plant and non-human animal, that evolutionary patterns, whether through the fossil record or otherwise, don't show some kind of linear progressive path, but show more of a bushy mosaic path. And human evolution shows a pattern just like that, a very bushy mosaic pattern. The introduction talks about this one species shown on the left-hand side of the slide. Now, clearly we don't know exactly what the species look like. We have sort of a computer-generated rendition of Homo naledi. But we do have the fossils shown in the bottom left of this species. It's only recently been discovered from a cave in South Africa. Many bones representative of many different individuals give us a pretty good picture of what this species look like. So that's what this chapter is about, looking at human evolution, the patterns of our origin. And we're going to start off here mainly focused on the fossil record. And later on the chapter, we dive into comparative genetics that also reveals clues about how and why humans, I see a typo there, have evolved. So let's dive in and learn some more. Now, of course, in Darwin's Origin of Species, he laid out a very clear case for the theory of evolution, which not many people can really say what that is, but that are non-biologists. But as you guys have learned, the theory of evolution fundamentally says that we are all related in one big tree of life. We all share common ancestors with everything else. And the adaptations that we have, the unique characteristics that different species have, came about by natural selection. And Darwin laid out pretty clearly evidence for the common ancestry, the relationships of all species. And he laid out pretty clearly evidence for natural selection, but he really skirted around the issue of human evolution. And most likely that was out of concern that his theory would be rejected because of conflicts with religious thought and belief. So he took a careful approach. But about 13 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, he went ahead and published another book called The Descent of Man, where he focused on human evolution, and he pointed out our primate origins, that we are most closely related to primates. The figure here on the left of the slide coming out of our book is showing the homology of the coccyx, the series of short little vestigial tail bones in humans, and those bones are homologous with several of the bones at the base of the tail in tailed primates. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this human-primate relationship. So relatively recent phylogenetic analysis, that is maybe about within the past 10 years, of whole genomes of many different species of primates shows just how Homo sapiens, our own species, is deeply embedded within the primates. It's pretty unambiguous. So now not only do we have good solid molecular, DNA evidence to go by in terms of primate phylogenetic relationships, but we also of course have a fossil record with fossil primates that helps to reveal some key dates by which primate evolution was taking some important steps. So for example, as noted here, calibration of a molecular clock using fossil primates, where we know how old those fossil primates are, so we can calibrate the molecular clock to see the rate of molecular evolution that's happened, and thereby estimate how long ago nodes bifurcated in our phylogenetic tree here. Anyway, that's kind of hearkening back to how the molecular clock is used. But anyway, here we can see the primate origins are estimated by molecular clock analysis to be about 70 to 79 million years ago. Now recall that that would still be in the Cretaceous period, when large dinosaurs were still roaming around and dominating terrestrial landscapes. Recall that the end Cretaceous extinction from the impact of a giant asteroid occurred about 66.2 million years ago. So of course this implies that primates were originating before that impact. We don't have fossils of those early primates. Again, this is an estimate using a molecular clock. The actual oldest fossil primates we have are 55 million years old, and they clearly show that these early primate animals were small and arboreal, as primates generally tend to be, making them fundamentally different from other mammals. Now the split between old world monkeys and apes, which if you look at our phylogenetic tree on the left-hand hand of the slide, old world monkeys are shown up on the top in kind of a reddish color. Those would be monkeys that we find in Africa and in Asia. Whereas New World monkeys are those that are found in South America, Central America, and indeed were found here in North America before they went extinct. So that common ancestor of New World monkeys and Old World monkeys and apes goes even farther back. But I'm wandering here. The point I'm making is the split between apes, which is shown in green, and Old World monkeys, which is shown in red, was about 30 to 35 million years ago. So there we have the origin of apes, which includes gibbons and orangutans, gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and of course, hominins. There's some evidence of hybridization between different species of primates. That's shown in figure 17.6. I'm not showing it here. Some of that hybridization, some of that transfer of alleles between different species of primates, that's called introgression, by the way, when genetics introgresses or goes into from one species to another, that introgression was adaptive. And so that hybridization may have been favorable in some cases for adaptive evolution. So the last thing I'd point out before we move on here is this little blown up part of the phylogenetic tree that's shown to the left, and is more specifically showing how we as Homo sapiens are most closely related to the genus Pan, which includes chimpanzees and bonobos. And there's a little timeline there that shows how long ago that split was, maybe about 7 million years ago. And then the next closest relatives to us, Pan and Homo, would be gorilla. And we have looked at this earlier in this course, going back farther than 10 million years ago. And then orangutans, we would need to go back almost 20 million years ago to find a common ancestor with them. So here we go with a pretty interesting figure from your book showing the tremendous diversity of hominins that we have discovered through the fossil record. And again, the fossil record and a molecular clock suggest that our lineage, the hominin lineage, split from Pan about 7.3 to 8.4 million years ago. After that split, at least 20 species of hominins evolved. We know this from the fossil record, although this figure shows over 30 different species or genetic variants. Now, identifying different species of hominins has been challenging and very controversial. How come? Well, the scarcity of fossils. I mean, we have found some pretty impressive and key fossils, but still, they're not, like oozing out of the ground for us. So the scarcity of fossils combined with fragmentary fossils, meaning, we often don't have a complete skeleton, but we might have part of a skull, or we might have a pelvis with part of a leg bone or something like that, makes assignment to species challenging. And so I think a lot of anthropologists and paleontologists, I should say, argue that we've exaggerated a bit the number of hominin species that were out there. So I don't think it's been up there at 30 species. But I think the diversity that we have, it's really safe to say that we have at least 20 species, 20 independently evolving lineages of hominins. So, before you leave this particular slide and this video goes on, take a look at how much overlap there is temporally on a time scale with these different species / variants. The point being that at any one point in time, there were several different hominin species living, particularly in Africa, at the same time. There was quite a bit of diversity. And some of them came and went in relatively short time periods. Others, like I'm pointing down here, Homo erectus, existed for quite a while. So again, this goes to the point that there was really a bushy mosaic pattern of hominin evolution, very similar to other kinds of animals. So because of all the overlapping variation, making sense of phylogeny of hominins has been pretty challenging. Homoplasy, as I start off pointing out here on this slide, has made phylogenetic resolution difficult to obtain. Of course, homoplasy referring to both convergent evolution and reversals. So it might be, perhaps, as I note here, that hybridization was common among hominin lineages, and that hybridization would have spread or shared traits back and forth between lineages. That complicates phylogenetic trees that are, bifurcating and forking. So hybridization may have been one factor that complicates our efforts to resolve hominin phylogeny. Another is that there very well may have been parallel evolution happening pretty commonly among hominin lineages, meaning that, for example, one lineage in one part of our tree may have favored like eating certain types of food, certain types of plants, and another lineage that was on a nearby part of our hominin tree also may have been in parallel selecting for the same kind of anatomy, for the same kind of food. So that complicates our attempts to resolve phylogeny. Now, the figure that's shown here on the slide is kind of a consensus picture that shows what we're pretty confident of, the relationships that we're fairly confident about based on our fossil record. And overall, what we can see is, number one, look at the timeline again. We're going back to about 7.5 million years ago when we start to get the first fossil evidence of hominins. This genus down here, Sahelanthropus, tongue twister, is our oldest fragment of a hominin. It was just part of a skull. And so the time period there is not very long. But in general, if you look down at the bottom of my bullet points, the main patterns we see in human evolution or hominin evolution is bipedalism. So a relatively gradual transition in fits and starts, going from an arboreal lifestyle and anatomy for being arboreal to a bipedal lifestyle, walking on land. And again, in several different fossils, we see a mosaic pattern of both arboreal adaptations and bipedal adaptations. That's what we see mostly in early hominin evolution, is our adaptations popping up related to bipedalism and feeding adaptations, teeth and jaws, different food sources. Now, larger brains is another big thing that we see in hominin evolution. The earlier species of hominins, especially Australopithecus, where we have some skull, and Australopithecus, different species where we have skull, Poranthropus, where we have skull. All those craniums in those skulls are about chimpanzee size. They're about 400 cubic centimeters in volume. So brains weren't really getting much bigger. But when we get down to the genus Homo, that's where we start to see brains getting bigger. And Homo habilis had a brain about 600 cubic centimeters, a little bit bigger. And, modern humans, us, we have brains that are about 1,400 cubic centimeters. So we have an increase in brain volume of, 3 times. So that's another big event. And coinciding with larger brains is tool use. So that's a third big evolutionary event in hominin evolution, is tool use. And as you'll see in this presentation here, which is part 1 of this chapter, tool use really began in Australopithecenes, these kinds of creatures down here, but it started to become more advanced with the genus Homo with bigger brains. So this is our consensus tree. This is what we have a pretty good sense of, and let's go forward and dive in a little bit more. So we're going to first take a look at this early hominin evolution. Starts off with some of these fragmentary fossils, and the focus is mostly on locomotion, transitioning from that arboreal lifestyle to a more bipedal lifestyle. So that's mostly what we're discussing and focusing on here, with the title in this section of your textbook literally being Walking into a New Kind of Life. So first point to be made is that chimpanzees and bonobos have what's called facultative bipedality. So that means that they primarily rely on being arboreal, and their bodies are adapted really for being in the trees. But they do spend time on the ground, and they are able to walk on two legs, but that's not their optimum, being two-legged. So that's where the facultative term comes in. It means they can walk on two legs, they can be bipedal, and they are for short distances, but they're really prefer and are better adaptive for being up in the trees. Now, I don't have a figure here of this partial skull that's referred to for Sahelanthropus, but we do have a partial skull of this creature that we've given this name, and its foramen magnum, the large opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord enters into the brain, is positioned vertically. It's vertically oriented, which that's how we are, and that goes along with being bipedal. Whereas chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, our other primate ape relatives have a foramen magnum that's not vertically oriented, but it's more at the back of the skull. And so that coincides more with being quadrupedal and not bipedal. So even though we just have a partial skull, this ancient creature is suggesting to us that bipedality was beginning to evolve very early in the hominin lineage. Now we've got this other fragment of a skeleton, a femur with a distinct ball on the top, and we have named this genus Auroran. It's about 6 million years old, and the interpretation is that femur with that joint would have been an adaptation to carrying the weight of the body in a more upright position. So again, just a fragment of a skeleton, but still a fragment that suggests more bipedal locomotion. Now, when we get to about 4.4 million years ago, we now have a series of fossils showing up that belong to the genus we call Ardipithecus. And Ardipithecus ramidus is the most well-known of these. And these are showing a distinct transition from arboreal to bipedal. But they're a combination of the two, for sure. So Ardipithecus ramidus had shorter fingers and a stiffer foot compared to chimpanzees. So shorter fingers, implying they're not up in the trees as much. A stiffer foot, meaning it's being adapted more for walking, for being bipedal. But the Ardipithecus ramidus still had opposable toes. So it seems pretty clear from this evidence as well as others that they were spending time in the trees, but they were also spending a little more time walking around on the ground. So here's a figure on the bottom right showing the skeleton of Ardipithecus ramidus. It's a pretty impressive fossil. And then an artist's rendition of what this animal may have looked like, with, of course, the head and the proportions and the gait all being reflective of what we can tell from the anatomy. So really Ardipithecus is, as I state at the end here in these kind of bullet points, it's not as well adapted for the trees as chimpanzees, but it's not also it's not well adapted to walk long distances or run like we can in the genus Homo. So mosaic transitions. So I encourage you to go back and look, especially at that consensus phylogenetic tree, to get a sense of where we are as I review and talk about this hominin evolution. But here we have a reference to creatures that we call Australopithecenes. And there are two genera that make up the Australopithecenes. Australopithecus, which is fairly diverse. We have several distinct species of Australopithecus, and another one called Poranthropus. So see figure 17.8 for that. Now, Australopithecus, remember that our taxonomy in biology, we have argued to only recognize and name monophyletic groups. Australopithecus is not monophyletic. Some of those species are more closely related to Paranthropus and to Homo than they are to other Australopithecus. So point being that biologists kind of need to clean up the taxonomy here. But let's not go down that path. What do the Australopithecenes look like? What do they tell us? Well, they had long arms and fingers, and they had those 400 cubic centimeter brains. I should have put a 3 over the centimeter for volume, pardon me, which those character traits are very similar still to chimpanzees. But how are they a little bit more like us in the genus Homo? Well, the Australopithecenes had double curved spines, and they had straighter legs, and their knees were below their midline. All three of these character states, all three of these traits suggest bipedal walking. These character states support bipedal walking. So these animals were even more bipedal than Sahelanthropus or Auroran or Ardipithecus, more bipedal. The figure on the top left here shows some remarkable footprints, 3.6 million year old footprints that were left by Australopithecus animals following a volcanic eruption in which volcanic ash was deposited on the ground. And these creatures were walking along in the ash post-eruption, and their footprints became fossilized. Now, we've learned a lot from these footprints. What we can see is here on the left, we've got a human footprint, our own, Homo sapiens. In the middle, we've got an Australopithecus footprint, and on the right, we've got a chimpanzee footprint. And what we see is this Australopithecus footprint. It's not identical to us, Homo, but it is much more similar to us than it is to a chimpanzee. One of the features is that the heel is digging in fairly deep when they're walking. And so the heel is striking first on the ground, and then the toes are pushing off, and that's how we walk. Chimpanzees don't locomote like that. In addition, you can see the foot of a chimpanzee is much broader. They have an opposable toe. They can use their feet for clinging up in the trees. This Australopithecus was much more like us and much more adapted to walking. Now look on the bottom left, the text I have down there, and the accompanying figure on the right. What this is making the point about is that climate change was going on to a significant degree during this period of time, and the expansive tropical rainforests in Africa were being broken up into more grassland and open woodlands. The artist's rendition here in figure A is kind of representing this sort of open woodland grassland habitat that Australopithecenes were evolving in. And so this kind of change in the ecosystem and the change in the habitats may have fostered, probably did foster, adaptations for bipedality. These animals were having to walk, were having to locomote longer distances between trees, perhaps having to locomote and walk, of course, on the ground farther distances to get food. So climate change can be argued to have been a significant force, a significant selective pressure on the evolution of hominins and our bipedal locomotion and our anatomies for that. In fact, look at figure B. It's a neat little figure that's showing how this Australopithecus is an amalgamation, a mosaic of anatomical features that are more adapted for being arboreal. Those have the letter C written by them, versus anatomical features that go along with being more bipedal. Those have the letter W written by them. So I won't go over this whole figure, but look it over, check it out, and notice, think about this mosaic of anatomical features for both being arboreal and bipedal. So what we're seeing here is that diet almost certainly was a factor in our hominin evolution. And, coming down out of the rainforests and perhaps living in these more open woodlands and so on was forcing our ancestors, if you will, to rely upon less reliable food sources, having to scavenge for a greater variety of food sources. Chimpanzees, bonobos, they have bigger incisors, front teeth, bigger canines, whereas early hominids had smaller ones, smaller incisors, smaller canines, and their molars were bigger and flatter. So, and the enamel on their teeth, on hominin teeth, was also thicker. So this kind of coincides with eating foods that required more crushing and more grinding. So coming out of the trees, they were, and having the forest, the tropical forest disappear, they weren't able to rely upon fruits and soft leaves like chimpanzees and bonobos have access to, but perhaps we're having to shift to seeds and nuts and maybe digging for roots and tubers and things like that. So we see transitions in teeth and jaws that tell us that there's transitions in diets, and those transitions again go along with changes in the climate, changes in the landscape. We're going to wrap up this part 1 of my videos here on chapter 17 on human evolution in talking about tool makers. Part 2, we're going to transition into Homo, our own genus, Homo, and the evolution of our genus. In the early 1960s, early stone tools were discovered with fossils of Homo habilis. It's basically one of our earliest species of Homo, going back about almost 2 million years. And these tools are about 1.75 million years old. And Homo habilis is referred to as handyman because of the tools that were discovered at the same sites. So a hypothesis was formed by paleontologists at that time that tool use was maybe coming about because of bigger brains in Homo. But there's a problem with that hypothesis. First of all, even chimpanzees and bonobos use tools. They don't make them. but they use sticks and stones and leaves as tools. Again, they don't manufacture stone tools such as the ones shown on the upper left here, but they do use tools, so we can expect that the earliest hominins also used tools. In fact, since those discoveries of tools with Homo habilis, there have been older tools, stone tools, discovered, upwards of 3.3 million years old, discovered in Ethiopia. These stone tools cannot have been from any Homo species because we have no evidence that Homo was around back then. These stone tools must have been fashioned, based on the evidence we have right now, by Australopithecenes. Now remember, the Australopithecenes still had brains that were about the size of a chimpanzee. Their brains really hadn't evolved to be much bigger. So point being, Australopithecenes, even though they had small brains, were starting to make stone tools. And these stone tools, the very bottom picture is showing some scrape marks on bone. And these scrape marks are very consistent with the type of scraping that we would see in using a stone to carve flesh off of bones. So they probably weren't using these tools to actually kill things, but most likely these Australopithecenes were scavenging like hyenas do for meat, and they were able to process that meat more efficiently. And by getting access to meat, they're getting access to more protein, more fat, more calories, and that is very possibly what fueled bigger bodies and bigger brains in the genus Homo, is now having access and the ability to use tools to get access to food resources that would be necessary to fuel bigger, more complex brains.